Ma'am, hey,
Yes?
I need you to stand up right now.
For what? I'm on my...
We got a call. ID, now.
I was sitting on my front porch reading a book when the patrol car pulled up across the street. I thought maybe there was a problem with one of my neighbors. A break-in. A noise complaint. Something routine. Then the officer got out, looked directly at me, and started walking across my lawn with purpose. That's when I knew. This wasn't about my neighbors. This was about me. My name is Commander Patricia Thornton, and I've been with the Sheriff's Department for 21 years. I've worked narcotics, organized crime, and internal affairs. I've led multi-agency task forces. I've testified before grand juries. I've received the department's Medal of Honor twice. And on that Thursday evening in June, I was about to be questioned on my own property by a deputy who'd graduated from the academy 4 months ago. A deputy whose application I'd personally approved. A deputy who had absolutely no idea that the woman he was about to interrogate was fourth in command of the entire sheriff's department. The evening started beautifully. It was early summer, one of those perfect June evenings where the heat of the day fades into comfortable warmth. The sun was low on the horizon, painting everything in golden light. Birds were singing. Kids were playing basketball a few houses down. The neighborhood had that peaceful end-of-day feeling. I'd gotten home from the office around 6. Changed out of my uniform into comfortable clothes. Black yoga pants. An old college sweatshirt. Bare feet. My hair was down for the first time all week, loose around my shoulders instead of pulled back in the tight bun I wore on duty. I looked nothing like Commander Thornton. I looked like Patricia, a 44-year-old woman enjoying her evening. I'd made myself a cup of tea, grabbed the novel I'd been trying to finish for 2 months, and settled into the wicker chair on my front porch. My front porch. The porch I'd sat on hundreds of times over the 8 years I'd lived in this house. The porch where I'd had coffee with neighbors, watched my niece play in the yard, and decompressed after difficult days at work. The house is in Riverside Meadows, a quiet neighborhood about 15 minutes from downtown. It's solidly middle class. Mix of single-family homes and duplexes. Decent-sized yards. Mature trees. The kind of neighborhood where people wave when they drive by and everyone knows the mail carrier's name. The demographics are pretty mixed. Maybe 50% white, 30% black, 20% Latino and Asian. I'm black. When I first moved in, I'd wondered if there would be issues. You never know. But the neighborhood had been welcoming. My next-door neighbors, an older white couple named Jim and Sandra Morrison, had brought over cookies the day I moved in. The family across the street, the Nguyen's, had invited me to their daughter's graduation party. I'd become friends with several people on the block. It felt like home. But there are always outliers. Always someone who sees your presence as a problem. Someone who makes assumptions based on skin color rather than reality. I'd experienced it before. The colleague who seemed surprised I'd been promoted. The store clerk who followed me through aisles. The subtle moments that remind you that some people will always see race first and person second. I was 3 chapters into my book when I noticed the patrol car. Sheriff's Department vehicle, marked unit, driving slowly down the street. Not unusual. Deputies patrolled our area regularly. I glanced up briefly, then returned to my book. The car stopped. Right across the street from my house. I looked up again. The deputy was sitting in the vehicle, but I could see him looking at something. Looking at me, I realized. Studying me. My professional instincts activated. I've been in law enforcement long enough to recognize when someone's interest moves from casual observation to focused attention. This deputy wasn't just looking around. He was looking at me. Assessing me. The driver's door opened and a young deputy got out. White male, couldn't be more than 24 or 25, with that fresh from the academy bearing. Squared shoulders. Serious expression. Hand instinctively positioned near his duty belt. He didn't cross at the crosswalk. He walked directly across the street, through my yard, straight toward my porch. Everything about his body language said this was official business. I set my book down and stood up. Stayed at the top of the porch steps. Kept my posture relaxed but alert. I've conducted enough interviews and confrontations to know how to read situations, and this one was heading somewhere I didn't like. The deputy stopped at the bottom of my porch steps. "Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions." I kept my voice neutral. "About what?" "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this neighborhood. I need to verify your reason for being here." The words landed with familiar weight. Verify your reason for being here. Not, do you live here? Not, have you seen anything unusual? Verify your reason for being here. As if my presence on my own porch required justification. "I live here," I said simply. "This is my house." The deputy's expression didn't change. "Can I see some identification that proves that? Can I ask what the specific suspicious activity was that prompted this visit?" "Just need to see some ID, ma'am." I felt the decision tree opening in my mind. The same tree every person of color knows. Comply immediately and hope it ends quickly. Assert your rights and risk escalation. Find the middle ground where you protect yourself legally while not appearing threatening. It's a calculation we make dozens of times throughout our lives, and the variables change based on circumstances, location, and the demeanor of the officer. "I'm sitting on my front porch reading a book," I said, keeping my tone factual rather than confrontational. "That's not suspicious activity." "So I'm asking what specifically prompted this contact." The deputy's jaw tightened slightly. "We received a call about someone who doesn't fit the neighborhood profile acting suspiciously around residential properties." There it was. Someone who doesn't fit the neighborhood profile. Code words. Dog whistle. The polite way of saying someone who's black in a predominantly white area. "And what profile is that exactly?" I asked. "Ma'am, I'm not going to debate this with you. I need to see identification proving you have legal right to be on this property. Legal right to be on my own property." The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. "Deputy, what's your name and badge number?" He hesitated, then answered. "Deputy Cameron Voss. Badge 4782. Cameron Voss." The name was familiar. It took me a moment to place it, then it clicked. I'd reviewed his academy application 4 months ago. Sat on the hiring board that approved his entry into the department. I remembered his application specifically because he'd written an essay about wanting to serve all members of the community equally and fairly. I'd been impressed by his apparent understanding of constitutional policing. I'd voted to hire him. And now here he was, demanding I prove I had the right to sit on my own porch. "Deputy Voss, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to think carefully about your answers. First, what specific suspicious activity was reported? What action did the caller describe?" Voss shifted his weight. "Someone who appeared to be casing houses." Casing houses. "And what was I doing that appeared to be casing houses?" "The caller said you were sitting on a porch watching the neighborhood." Sitting on a porch. Watching the neighborhood. That's the suspicious activity? In combination with not fitting the demographic profile of residents, yes. He'd said it out loud. Not fitting the demographic profile. Being black in a neighborhood he'd decided was too white for me to belong. "Deputy Voss, do you understand what reasonable suspicion means?" His expression hardened. "Ma'am, I'm not here to discuss legal theory. I'm here to verify your identity and your right to be on this property. And I'm asking you what legal basis you have for that demand. Because sitting on a porch reading a book is not reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Are you refusing to provide identification? I'm asking you to articulate your legal justification for demanding it." Voss's hand moved closer to his duty belt. Not threatening, exactly, but positioning. "Ready. Ma'am, I can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." "The easy way or the hard way?" The implicit threat. Comply or face consequences. Submit or be forced to submit. Never mind the Constitution. Never mind my rights. Never mind that I was sitting on my own porch minding my own business. I made my decision. I was going to give him identification. But first, I was going to make absolutely certain he understood what he was doing. Deputy Voss, I'm going to comply with your request. But I want you to understand something first. I'm Commander Patricia Thornton. I've been with this department for 21 years. I'm the commander of Criminal Investigations Division. And as of 2 months ago, when Sheriff Bradley reorganized command structure, I'm fourth in the chain of command for this entire department. I watched the color drain from his face in real time. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. No words came out. I was on the hiring board that approved your application, I continued, my voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. I read your essay about fair and constitutional policing. I voted to bring you into this department. And now, 4 months later, you're standing in my yard demanding I prove I have the right to sit on my own porch because someone called to report that a black woman doesn't fit the neighborhood profile. Voss took a step backward. Commander, I didn't know. Didn't know I was a commander? Or didn't know that demanding ID from someone sitting on their own porch without reasonable suspicion is a Fourth Amendment violation? The call said. They reported suspicious activity. What activity? Be specific. What action did I take that constitutes suspicious activity? He couldn't answer. Because there was no answer. I'd been sitting. Reading. Existing. Deputy Voss, I need you to explain your reasonable suspicion. Because from where I'm standing, you responded to a call that described nothing criminal, observed me engaged in completely lawful activity on private property, and demanded identification based solely on the fact that I'm a black woman in a neighborhood someone decided should be all white. Is that an accurate assessment? No, ma'am. I mean, the call described someone casing houses. Show me your body cam footage right now. Show me one thing I did that looks like casing houses. One action. One movement. One behavior. Voss looked stricken. I don't have my body cam on. You don't have your body cam on, I repeated slowly. You approached a citizen to conduct an investigative stop, and you don't have your camera recording? I forgot to activate it. You forgot. Or you didn't want this encounter documented? I forgot. Commander, I swear I didn't know who you were. That's the problem, Deputy. You should treat every citizen the way you'd treat me if you knew who I was. Every person deserves the same constitutional protections regardless of rank or position or race. But you didn't do that. You saw a black woman and assumed she didn't belong. Voss looked like he might be sick. What do you want me to do? I want you to return to your patrol car. I want you to drive back to the station. I want you to report this encounter immediately to your shift supervisor. I want you to write a detailed incident report documenting every aspect of this stop. And then I want you to wait for me to file a formal complaint with professional standards. Commander, please. Please what? Please don't hold you accountable. Please overlook the fact that you violated department policy and constitutional law. Please ignore that you profiled your own commanding officer. I made a mistake. Yes. You did. And mistakes have consequences. Especially when they involve violating people's rights. Voss stood there for another moment, clearly hoping I'd change my mind. When I didn't say anything else, he turned and walked back to his patrol car with the posture of someone heading to an execution. I watched him drive away, then sat back down in my wicker chair. My hands were shaking. Not from fear. From rage. Controlled, professional rage that I'd learned to channel over 2 decades in law enforcement. But rage nonetheless. I picked up my phone and called the shift supervisor directly. Lieutenant Marcus Webb answered on the first ring. Commander Thornton. What can I do for you? Marcus, I need to report an incident. One of your deputies, Cameron Voss, just conducted an unlawful stop at my residence. There was a pause. At your residence? I was sitting on my front porch reading. He approached and demanded identification, claiming he'd received a call about suspicious activity. When I asked what activity, he said someone casing houses. When I asked what I'd done that appeared to be casing houses, he said sitting on a porch watching the neighborhood while not fitting the demographic profile. Jesus Christ. He demanded ID without reasonable suspicion. He threatened me with arrest if I didn't comply. And he didn't have his body cam activated. Patricia, I'm sorry. This is unacceptable. I want a full professional standards investigation. I want the dispatch recording. I want to know who made that call. And I want to know if Voss has a pattern. You'll have all of it. I'll flag this immediately. Voss will be on administrative duty pending review. I also want to know who his training officer was. Because this isn't just bad judgment. This is learned behavior. I'll pull all his training records. Is there anything else you need? I need to know this is being taken seriously. It is. I promise you. This is a priority. The professional standards investigation began the next morning. 2 senior investigators, Captain Rita Morales and Sergeant Kenneth Briggs, were assigned. They interviewed me first. I provided a detailed written statement and a recorded interview walking through every moment. The initial observation of Voss watching me. His approach across my lawn. The demand for identification. His admission that the basis was not fitting the demographic profile. The threat of arrest. The lack of body cam footage. They pulled the dispatch recording immediately. The call had come from a blocked number. The caller, a woman, had reported a black female on Clearview Drive who appears to be surveilling houses and doesn't belong in the neighborhood. No house number. No description of specific criminal behavior. Just race, vague location, and the loaded phrase, doesn't belong. The dispatcher had asked standard follow-up questions. What specific activity made the person suspicious? Was there a crime in progress? Could the caller provide more details? The caller had been vague. She's just sitting there watching. This is a safe neighborhood. We don't have people like that here. People like that. The dispatcher had logged the call and sent it to Voss's unit. But the dispatcher's notes included a flag, caller vague, no specific criminal activity described, possible bias-motivated call. Voss had responded to the call anyway. Without verifying the address. Without observing first. Without considering that sitting on a porch might actually mean someone lived there. Morales and Briggs pulled Voss's complete history. 4 months on patrol. 38 stops during that time. 27 of those stops, 71%, involved people of color. In a district that was 47% people of color, Voss was stopping minorities at significantly disproportionate rates. They dug deeper. Of those 27 stops of people of color, 18 had been based on calls about suspicious persons or people who don't belong. They pulled the dispatch recordings for all 18. The pattern was striking. Every single call had been vague. Every single call had mentioned race as a primary descriptor. Every single call had used coded language like doesn't belong or doesn't fit the area or seems out of place. And in 14 of those 18 cases, the person stopped turned out to live in the neighborhood, work in the area, or have completely legitimate reasons for being there. Voss had been responding to racially biased calls and conducting stops without doing basic investigation first. The investigators also found that Voss had failed to activate his body cam on 9 separate occasions. Department policy required cameras to be activated for all citizen contacts. Voss had either forgotten repeatedly or had deliberately avoided documentation. Either way, it was a serious policy violation. They interviewed Voss 3 times over 2 weeks. He maintained that he'd been following department procedures, responding to calls, doing his job. When confronted with the statistical disparity in his stops, Voss claimed it was coincidence. When asked why he hadn't observed me before approaching, he said the call had indicated suspicious activity and he'd responded appropriately. When Morales pointed out that sitting on a porch reading a book is not suspicious activity, Voss fell back on, the caller said she was watching the neighborhood. When Briggs asked what I'd been watching, Voss admitted he hadn't actually observed me doing anything. When they asked why he hadn't activated his body cam, Voss claimed he'd forgotten in the stress of the moment. They asked him directly, "Did you approach Commander Thornton because she was black?" Voss denied it. Said it was about the call. About the reported suspicious behavior. When pressed on what behavior, he couldn't articulate anything that didn't come down to race and presence. The investigators also traced the training lineage. Voss's field training officer during his probationary period had been Deputy Lawrence Hendricks, a 14-year veteran. They pulled Hendricks's records and found concerning patterns. 8 complaints alleging racial profiling over his career. 5 sustained. Multiple disciplines. 2 suspensions. But never terminated. More troubling, they found that Hendricks had trained 6 probationary deputies over the past 4 years. 5 of those 6 showed similar patterns in their stop data. Disproportionate stops of people of color. High rates of responding to vague, suspicious person calls in minority neighborhoods or when minorities entered predominantly white areas. Multiple complaints alleging bias. Hendricks hadn't just engaged in racial profiling himself. He'd trained others to do it while calling it community policing and proactive patrolling. The investigation took 8 weeks. The findings were comprehensive and damning. Voss had conducted an unlawful stop without reasonable suspicion. He had demanded identification without legal justification. He had profiled a citizen based on race. He had failed to activate his body cam in violation of policy. And the pattern of his previous stop suggested systemic bias rather than isolated error. The recommendation was termination. Voss's attorney tried to negotiate. Argued he was inexperienced. Poorly trained. Influenced by a problematic field training officer. They pointed to his academy essay about fair policing and suggested he had good intentions but bad execution. They proposed suspension, remedial training, extended probation, anything except termination. Sheriff Bradley shut it down personally. He profiled a commander in her own yard. If he'll do that to someone fourth in command, what is he doing to citizens who don't have the authority to fight back? The attorney had no response. Voss was terminated 9 weeks after the incident. He appealed. The appeal was denied. His law enforcement career ended at 24 years old. But the consequences rippled far beyond one deputy. Deputy Hendricks was removed from training duties immediately and placed under investigation. The review of his training methods revealed that he'd consistently taught probationary deputies to be extra vigilant in certain neighborhoods and to pay attention to people who don't fit. When investigators asked him to define what don't fit meant, Hendricks couldn't provide objective criteria. His explanations always circled back to subjective assessments that, when examined closely, were based on racial assumptions. Hendricks was offered a choice: retire immediately or face termination proceedings. He chose retirement, forfeiting any ceremonial honors or recognition. The 5 other deputies he'd trained were all flagged for review. 2 showed such significant patterns of bias that they were terminated. 2 others underwent intensive retraining and supervision. The 5th had already left the department for other reasons. The department also investigated the anonymous caller. They traced the blocked call to a specific address in Riverside Meadows. A woman named Margaret Sutherland had made not just this call, but 11 previous calls over 3 years about suspicious people in the neighborhood. 10 of those 11 calls involved people of color. 7 of those people turned out to be residents or legitimate visitors. Investigators visited Sutherland and informed her that filing false reports was a crime and using emergency services to racially profile neighbors could result in prosecution. They warned that future calls would be investigated for bias and could lead to charges. The calls from her number stopped immediately. But the reforms went far beyond individual accountability. The sheriff's department recognized that my case had exposed systemic failures. They implemented comprehensive changes. All probationary deputies would now rotate through multiple training officers, preventing any single officer from having disproportionate influence. Anonymous calls about suspicious persons, with no specific criminal activity, would be flagged in dispatch. If calls only included race and location without describing actual criminal behavior, dispatchers would be required to push back and request specific information about what made the person suspicious. All stops would be tracked monthly and analyzed for racial disparities. Deputies whose stop patterns showed significant demographic skewing would be flagged for immediate review. Body cam footage from 10% of all stops would be randomly audited by a civilian review board to ensure constitutional compliance. The department created a robust early intervention system. Any deputy with 4 or more complaints alleging similar conduct within 18 months would be automatically reviewed, even without sustained findings. Reviews would examine patterns, available footage, and stop data. They completely overhauled training. The previous implicit bias training had been 4 hours annually of online modules. The new training was 20 hours per year, in person, scenario-based, and designed to force deputies to confront assumptions about who belongs where and what actually constitutes reasonable suspicion. I helped develop the new curriculum. My experience became a central case study. Deputies watched a reenactment of what happened, since Voss hadn't activated his body cam. They heard the dispatch call with its vague, racially coded language. They saw the decision tree Voss faced and watched him make wrong choice after wrong choice. Then they were asked to identify every error, every assumption, every moment where bias overrode judgment. The training also included footage from several of Voss's other stops. Deputies watched him question a black teenager walking home from basketball practice. They watched him demand ID from a Latino contractor working on a house. They watched him stop an Asian woman jogging in a park. Trainers asked deputies to identify the reasonable suspicion in each case. There was none. The only constant was race and assumption. The department also established true civilian oversight. The previous Community Advisory Board had been toothless. The new board had subpoena power, could access all records and recordings, and could make binding disciplinary recommendations. The reforms were meaningful and necessary. But they'd required a commander being profiled on her own porch to make them happen. How many citizens had experienced the same thing? How many had filed complaints that were dismissed? How many times had the system failed before it worked because the victim had institutional power? I spoke publicly about the incident after the investigation concluded. I talked to community groups, other law enforcement agencies, and civil rights organizations. I shared not just my story but the data showing patterns of discriminatory policing. I talked about how bias operates even among people who believe they're fair. How it gets transmitted through training. How it hides behind phrases like, doesn't fit, and seems out of place. The story made local news, then regional, then national. A commander profiled on her own porch by a deputy she'd voted to hire. The irony was too stark to ignore. The audio from the dispatch call was released. Within days, it had been shared millions of times. Comment sections filled with similar stories. Black professionals questioned in their own yards. Latino families followed by deputies in their own neighborhoods. Asian business owners repeatedly asked to prove they owned their stores. Indigenous people treated as trespassers on their own ancestral lands. Voss gave one interview after his termination. Claimed he'd been unfairly scapegoated. Said he'd been responding to a legitimate call. When asked if he understood why his approach was problematic, he gave vague answers about needing better training. Never apologized to me. Never acknowledged his bias. Never took full responsibility. He tried to get hired at other departments. His applications were rejected when they found the case file. His law enforcement career was over. I continue serving as commander. Last year I was promoted to assistant sheriff. I now oversee all field operations, including training, community relations, and professional standards. The reforms we implemented after my encounter with Voss have become department culture. We've seen measurable improvements in community trust, reductions in complaints, and better policing outcomes. The house on Clearview Drive is still my home. I still sit on my front porch reading on summer evenings. And when patrol cars drive by now, deputies wave. Not because they recognize me specifically, but because they've learned the lesson. You can't assume who belongs and who doesn't based on appearance. You can't treat citizens differently based on race. And you can't let bias override basic police work. My encounter with Deputy Voss lasted less than 15 minutes. But the implications have lasted years. One rookie's bias-driven stop exposed a problematic training officer, revealed systemic failures in supervision, and sparked reforms that changed how an entire department operates. I was sitting on my porch reading a book. That's all. The only thing suspicious was the color of my skin in a neighborhood someone had decided should be all white. Voss saw race and made assumptions. Heard doesn't belong and never questioned what it meant. Approached with authority instead of observation. Demanded compliance instead of building understanding. Let bias override everything his training should have taught him. The lesson is clear. When you stop someone based solely on race, when you demand identification without reasonable suspicion, when you treat citizens as criminals simply because they don't match your expectations of who belongs where, you're not doing police work. You're engaging in discrimination. And the consequences are real. Should officers who profile fellow law enforcement personnel face permanent decertification? Thanks for watching. Do remember to hit the subscribe button, like and share this story, and I'll see you in the next one.